The State Tax Execution Modernization Act, House Bill 337, went into effect January 1, 2018. But let's talk about the old system first for recording, issuing, filing these state tax executions. The Department of Revenue would get a state tax execution, right? And it would then have to record it in the county where the taxpayer resides. The Department of Revenue could levy on property, but only in the county where the taxpayer resides. I live in Cobb County. If the Department of Revenue filed a lien against me, they would have to file it in Cobb County. Now, if the Department of Revenue then wanted to levy on property I owned in Bullock County, what did the Department of Revenue have to do? It had to send that same lien to the Bullock County Clerk of Court and get it recorded there. The Department of Revenue could re-record the lien every 7 years. It was only good for 7 years. If the Department of Revenue did not re-record after 7 years, what happened? Anybody know? It was no good. It was not enforceable. But that state tax execution, there it is, that looks like it's pretty scary. That's going to call attention to somebody. Some title examiner is going to see that and say, hold on. We got a cloud on title here. It's still going to present problems, okay? But just looking at that thing, and that's what these old state tax executions look like, and all the stamps are these state tax executions being re-recorded.
What year did that start?
I think it's a great question, Jeff. What year was that started? And I think it was 1998, okay? So it's been through, what, 4 or 5 site generations of being re-recorded? It's an old one, but I wanted to make my point. And the point is that this was a complete mess. It was a mess for us. It was a mess for the title examiners. It was a mess for the closing attorneys. It was a mess for the Department of Revenue. I mean, think about how time-consuming this was. Hey, Litwin's got land in Bullock County. Get this original state tax execution and send it to Bullock County and get it recorded and get it back here. And they had to maintain these batches and batches of paper. It was just becoming just logistically very, very difficult. And of course, how many counties do we have in Georgia? 159 counties in Georgia. Just imagine having to deal with 159 counties. So the old system was just intoxicated with problems. All right? So, January 1, 2018, we have a new, what we'll call a unified system. All state tax executions, and I'll show you one in just a minute, are recorded under one statewide system. You don't have to, the Department of Revenue doesn't have to send the execution to each county. Maybe, and we'll see because the law is changing as we're talking. Basically how it works though is that electronically the Department of Revenue now sends in batches these state tax executions to be recorded, and they send them to the Clerk's Authority, Georgia Superior Court Cooperative Clerk's Authority. Everybody's familiar with that? That's that site you can search for these things on. And then they accept the batches. They're not recorded yet. They're just accepted by the Clerk's Authority. Upon acceptance by the Clerk's Authority, they are deemed enforceable and recorded, okay? But those state tax executions, upon being accepted by the Clerk's Authority, have not been sent to the clerks of the respective superior courts, which have to be done because they have to be recorded. And of course, once they get to the clerk's office, where do they sit for 3 weeks? In somebody's in basket, right? Waiting to be recorded, waiting to be stamped, okay? So, because of that county lag, is what we'll call it, these state tax executions are now searchable on a separate database at the Clerk's Authority website. I don't know if anybody's ever seen it yet. It's only been a couple of weeks, called the State Department of Revenue Pending Lien Search Database. So during the time that these liens have been accepted but have not been recorded by the clerk's offices, they're sitting in this pending database, and that's where you can go to search for a lien that has not been recorded by the clerk's office. And then, of course, once they are recorded by the clerk's office, they come out of that database, and you can just go to the regular Clerk's Authority database that you've always used, or you can go to the Department of Revenue's database, because they're going to have one too at the Georgia Tax Center, which they already have. I'm signed up for it. The great thing about the new law is these new liens, which again you'll see one in just a second, are going to have status labels. So, you know, you look at this one and you say, well, what's the status of this thing? Who has any idea? I mean, it would take you about 2 hours to sit down and figure out what the status of that thing is. But the new liens are going to have these status labels: active, expired, withdrawn, re-enrolled, released. It's a great thing. Now, what happens to all the state tax executions like this one that have been sitting out there through December 31, 2017? Anybody know? Well, under the new law, they're all void. They're all void unless they have been renewed and re-enrolled. If the Department of Revenue wanted to enforce one of those liens, and of course in my case they did, you'll see in just a second, they had to be re-enrolled, okay? They were renewable to the new database. And that's what the Department of Revenue did with several of them. They found the ones that they wanted, the choice ones, maybe the ones with a lot of money involved, and they re-recorded those. They were allowed to do that. The bottom bullet point down there at the bottom is the big issue here is the statute of limitations. We now have a 10-year statute of limitations. There is tolling, which I'll talk about in just a second, but that last bullet there explains that these older state tax executions that were re-recorded, they get 10 more years. So if the older state tax execution had maybe 5 more years left, now that and they were renewed, they get another 10 years. So they all expire. The ones that were renewed on January 1, they all expire on 12/31/2027. Now, any new state tax executions that are issued, let's say next year, those cannot be renewed. None of them can be renewed anymore. So if
how long do they have to renew the old ones?
They had until, great question. The question is, how long did they have to renew the old ones? They had until January 1, 2018. So if the old one was not renewed and is not showing up in the new system, it's no longer enforceable. Great question. Now, with 10-year life, you're going to have tolling. Okay? And this is where I see a lot of the litigation, probably after our lives. This is where you're going to see the litigation in 10 years. Was tolling really applicable in certain situations? But there's several situations where tolling applies. And you'll notice, and when I tell you these things, when I ran them off, they're just like the ones that the IRS uses. The period that an installment payment agreement is in effect, plus 90 days, just like the IRS. If there's a court proceeding to challenge the assessment amount or the amount asserted in the execution, the statute of limitation tolls. If there's any enforcement action by the Department of Revenue, the statute of limitations tolls. A bankruptcy filing will toll the statute of limitations, and an offer in compromise will toll the statute of limitations. Okay? Now, what do these things look like? That's the first page. I couldn't fit both of them on the same page. But as you'll see at the very top, you immediately know this is a re-enrollment of an old one. Okay? Much easier to read. Okay? I took out the guy's name and address, obviously, although I didn't have to as public record. You'll see in just a sec. Well, you can see right now why I took his name out. It's $2.8 million. But it's nice and clean. You know the county. You don't see a lot of stamps. Here's the second page, and that shows the amounts that he owes. There's a lot of money, folks. I know. He's just as scared as you probably are right now. Anyway, but this is a notice of tax lien re-enrollment. Okay? This is what we're going to start seeing now on the databases. So this is good. Now, having said all of that, after the lien is paid off, you're going to have a period of time during which the Department of Revenue has to satisfy the lien via the clerk's authority. That's all going to apply. And House Bill 661, which is expected to pass, it has not passed yet, is going to provide for new things that weren't considered under the old House Bill 337. And when I say old, it's only a year old. So there's not going to be any statewide attachment under old House Bill 337, or what was originally 337, under the State Tax Modernization Act. Remember I told you about Bullitt County, Cobb County? There's not going to be any statewide attachment. And the Department of Revenue, this is going to be interesting, they have 5 years after assessment to record the state tax execution.